In the stone corridors of Ironvale Keep, something is breaking that cannot be mended with steel or strategy. The Alpha King, warforged, feared by packs and councils alike, has not appeared in public for 3 days. Behind locked chamber doors, witnesses speak in hushed voices of crashes, of shattered glass, of a ruler's anguished roars cut suddenly into terrifying silence. They say Edmund Ironvale is unstable, that his mind works wrong, that the weight of the crown is finally crushing him. Every healer has been dismissed. Every council remedy has failed. The sensory storms that overwhelm him grow worse with each passing day, and the North teeters on the edge of chaos without its king. Until Meredith, a wolfless Omega mocked for her gentleness, forbidden from ever standing in royal presence, does the one thing no one else thought to try. She hums, and the Alpha King goes still. The crashes stop. His breathing steadies. For the first time in 72 hours, Edmund Ironvale finds ground beneath his feet. But the court watches in horror as their unbreakable king leans toward the presence of a servant girl they've spent years humiliating. The girl, they said, was too soft to survive pack life. The Omega, who was never supposed to matter. So now the Ironvale court faces an impossible question. What kind of bond forms without words, without ceremony, strong enough to calm an Alpha King in the grip of sensory collapse? And what will the Moon Council do when they discover the only one who can ground their king is the Omega they've forbidden him to acknowledge? Before we continue, please subscribe and like. It really helps the channel grow. Drop your city in the comments so I can see where you're tuning in from. Now, back to the story. Young Meredith stood elbow deep in water so dark with blood, it had turned the color of old iron. The training hall stones wouldn't come clean until head servant Margrave could see his reflection in them, and she'd been scrubbing since before dawn. Around her, the evening shift dissolved into its usual controlled chaos. High-ranking pack servants swept through with ceremonial armor barely wiped down, their pressed uniforms somehow making the filth they carried seem almost dignified. They dumped the pieces into Meredith's washing station without so much as a downward glance. A wave of bloodied water hit her square in the chest. Meredith gasped, stumbling backward as chunks of dried mud and gods knew what else clung to her already stained apron. She looked up instinctively, some small, foolish part of her still expecting an apology. But the servant was already turning away, laughing at something his companion had said. Hear that noise from the king's tower last night? They say he threw a healer through the door. Shh, not here. They disappeared through the archway as Meredith exhaled slowly and returned to her stone. One day, she whispered to the scrub brush in her hands, her voice barely audible over the splash of water. One day they'll see you're not useless. She hummed softly without realizing it. A tuneless, soothing sound she'd made since childhood, whenever her hands were occupied, and her mind needed quiet. Who are you talking to, Wolfless? The voice sliced across the hall, and Meredith's stomach dropped. She turned to find Lyra standing in the doorway, her training leathers spotless in a way Meredith's servant rags never were. At 19, Lyra was only a year older than Meredith, but she had her wolf. She had her rank. She had the casual cruelty of someone who'd never once questioned where she belonged. No one, Meredith said quickly, keeping her eyes on the stone in front of her, scrubbing harder, even though the blood had already lifted. Don't react. Don't give them the satisfaction. The wet rag hit her temple, hard enough to make her vision blur. She flinched, her hands jerking in the water, and the heavy stone she'd been cleaning slipped from her grip and landed with a tremendous splash. Dirty water sprayed across the floor in a wide, damning arc. Laughter erupted. Not just Lyra now. Other servants had paused their work to watch. "Can't even hold a stone," someone muttered. "Pathetic Omega." "Oi!" Head servant Margrave's voice boomed across the hall, sharp enough to silence the mockery instantly. "Clean yourself up and get out of my sight, runt. You're dripping filth all over stones I need spotless by the king's inspection." "The king hasn't inspected anything in days," someone whispered, then went silent. "Yes, head servant," Meredith whispered. She grabbed the cleanest corner of her ruined apron, it reeked of lye soap and something sour, and fled before the humiliation could burn any hotter. The corridor outside the training hall was blessedly empty and cold. Meredith pressed her back against the stone wall, her heart hammering, her hands still shaking from adrenaline she had no outlet for. "You're not useless," she told herself again, but the words felt hollow now, a scrubbed raw by too many years of repetition. From somewhere far above, distant but unmistakable, came the sound of something crashing. Then another, then a roar that cut off too sharply, like a beast choking on its own fury. The Alpha King's tower. Meredith tilted her head upward, listening. She didn't know Edmund Ironvale. She'd never even seen him up close. Omegas like her weren't permitted within 50 feet of royal presence. But she'd heard the whispers, the concerned murmurs from guards, the frustrated complaints from healers who left the keep in disgrace. They say his mind works wrong. They say he can't tolerate crowds, or noise, or touch. They say he's breaking. Meredith closed her eyes and, without thinking, began to hum again, soft, rhythmic, the same tune she'd hummed over the washing stones. The crashing above went silent. Meredith's eyes snapped open. For a long, strange moment, the keep seemed to hold its breath. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed down the spiral staircase far above her position. Meredith pushed herself off the wall and hurried toward the servants' quarters, her pulse racing for reasons she couldn't name. Whatever was breaking the Alpha King, she thought, it sounded like something she understood. But understanding wouldn't save her from what was coming. Because 3 floors above, Edmund Ironvale had heard something impossible through the chaos of his collapsing senses. A sound that didn't demand, didn't intrude, didn't hurt. And he would not forget it. Edmund Ironvale stood motionless in the center of his chambers, hands clenched at his sides, every muscle locked in a battle against his own senses. The torchlight was too bright. Not objectively. He knew that. The flames were the same height they'd been yesterday, the same distance from his eyes. But tonight, each flicker felt like a blade dragging across the inside of his skull. The shadows they cast moved wrong, fractured, multiplying across the stone walls in patterns that made his stomach turn. He'd already thrown his ceremonial armor against the far wall. Once. The crash had helped for exactly 4 seconds, before the silence afterward became worse than the noise. The weight of his leather tunic felt like iron chains. The seams pressed into his shoulders wrong. His collar sat too high against his throat. Breathe. He couldn't. From 3 floors below, the council chamber's evening session bled upward through the keep's ancient stone. Voices, dozens of them, overlapping, discordant, each word scraping against his mind like metal on glass. Instability of the crown. Hasn't appeared in days. Question his fitness. Edmund's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. They thought the walls were thick enough. They always did. 17 years ago. Look at me when I'm speaking to you, boy. Edmund kept his eyes on the floor. The patterns in the stone made sense. Predictable lines, safe. His father's hand struck him across the face, hard enough to snap his head sideways. I said, look at me, Edmund tried. He did, but his father's face was too close, too loud, too much, and his eyes wouldn't focus properly, and the candlelight kept stabbing into his peripheral vision and... Weak, his father spat. An alpha does not flinch. An alpha does not cover his ears like a frightened child. You will learn control, Edmund, or you will learn nothing. The darkness of the punishment chamber had been a mercy. Edmund learned quickly after that. Silence was armor. Stillness was strength. If he didn't react, they couldn't see what was happening inside him. If he didn't react, maybe it would stop mattering. The memory dissolved as a sharp knock rattled Edmund's chamber door. Your Majesty, Councillor Thorne's voice, clipped and cold. The Moon Council requires your presence. Immediately. Edmund's hands curled into fists. No. Your Majesty, I said no. A pause. Then lower, meant to carry to the other council members, undoubtedly standing in the corridor. He refuses again. Murmurs, agreement, concern wrapped in condescension. This cannot continue, someone said. The packs are losing faith. We need visibility, ceremony. He must appear at the harvest rite. At minimum. He's unstable, Thorne. We all see it. Edmund crossed the room in 3 strides and wrenched the door open. 6 council members stood in the hallway, their faces arranged in expressions of professional worry that didn't reach their eyes. Thorne recovered first. Your Majesty, we were just... I heard you. Edmund's voice came out flat, controlled, each word measured with the precision he'd learned as a child. I am not unstable. I am managing my kingdom exactly as I have for the past 8 years. You will not dictate my schedule. With respect, Your Majesty, Councillor Verin cut in smoothly, her tone dripping false deference. The people need to see their king. Rumors spread when you isolate yourself. Whispers of weakness. Then let them whisper. The harvest rite is in 4 days, Thorne pressed. Public, traditional. The entire court will attend. Your absence would be... Unacceptable, Verin finished. Edmund's vision began to fracture at the edges. The hallway torches were too bright. The council members stood too close together, their scents mixing into something acrid and wrong. Their voices overlapped, each syllable stacking on top of the last, until he couldn't separate meaning from noise. Your Majesty? He needed them to stop talking. He needed them to leave. He needed... From somewhere distant, down the spiral staircase, through stone and silence, came a sound, soft, rhythmic, tuneless and soothing, humming. Edmund's breath caught. The council members were still talking, but their voices had become background static, irrelevant. The sound, that sound, cut through everything else like a blade through silk. It didn't demand, it didn't intrude, and it simply was. And for 3 perfect seconds, the world slowed. Your Majesty. Thorne's voice sharpened with irritation. The humming stopped. Edmund's chest tightened as the cacophony of the hallway rushed back in. Too loud, too bright, too much. He stepped backward into his chambers and slammed the door in the council's faces. The lock slid home. Silence. He sank onto the edge of his bed, head in his hands, breathing through the aftermath of sensory collapse, the way he'd taught himself years ago. Slow counts, controlled exhales, focusing on the texture of the furs beneath his palms. But tonight, none of it worked. Tonight, his mind kept circling back to that sound. He'd heard it before, Days ago, maybe. A fragment caught in passing through the training hall. He'd dismissed it then as unimportant. But now, and in the wreckage of another failed day, Edmund found himself whispering into the darkness of his chambers. There was a sound once that made the world slow, and he needed to hear it again. Meredith was on her knees in the training hall corridor when the world shifted. She'd been assigned stone-scrubbing duty again, punishment for yesterday's disruption, though head servant Margrave hadn't needed an excuse. The blood had dried overnight into stubborn, rust-colored stains that required vinegar and a wire brush and patience Meredith was running dangerously low on. She worked in silence, keeping her head down, her movements small and unobtrusive, invisible the way Omegas were supposed to be. Then the guards came, boots hammered against stone in sharp, synchronized rhythm. 6 of them, flanking someone whose footsteps were heavier, slower, and deliberate in a way that made the air itself feel weighted. Meredith pressed herself flat against the wall, wire brush clutched to her chest, eyes locked on the floor. Don't look up, don't draw attention. But the footsteps stopped, right in front of her. Your Majesty, the council chamber is this way. I know where it is. The voice was low, rough-edged, strained in a way that made Meredith's instincts prickle with recognition. She risked a glance upward. Alpha King Edmund Ironvale stood 3 paces away, and he looked like a man barely holding himself together. His shoulders were locked rigid beneath his leather tunic. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. His eyes, pale gray and unfocused, stared at nothing, or everything, or some nightmare space between. The guards shifted closer, saw their armor clinking. Edmund flinched. It was barely visible, a twitch of his shoulders, a fractional tightening around his eyes. But Meredith saw it, felt it in the way his breathing hitched and his hands curled into white-knuckled fists. Then Councillor Thorne rounded the corner with 4 other council members, their voices preceding them like a tidal wave. Cannot postpone the harvest rite again, Your Majesty. The court expects. The alliance with the Western Pax requires your public showing weakness when we need strength. Too many voices, too many scents, perfumed oils clashing with leather and torch smoke, and the metallic tang of training hall blood. Too much noise echoing off stone walls designed to amplify sound for battle commands. Edmund's breathing went shallow. His pupils dilated. Meredith watched in horror as the Alpha King's entire body began to lock down. Shoulders rising toward his ears, hands clamping over the sides of his head, his chest heaving in rapid, desperate gulps of air that weren't reaching his lungs. Your Majesty? A guard stepped forward, hand moving toward Edmund's shoulder. Don't! Edmund choked out, stumbling backward. His back hit the wall. Guards drew weapons on instinct, not against threat, but as trained response to their king's distress. Steel rang against leather scabbards, the sound sharp and metallic, and exactly the wrong thing in this moment. Edmund's knees buckled. Someone get a healer. Move back. Give him space. What's wrong with him? Councillor Thorne's gaze snapped to Meredith, still pressed against the wall, frozen in place. You. His voice cracked like a whip. You'll remove the Omega, now. 2 guards moved toward her. Meredith should have run, should have obeyed, should have done anything except what she did next. Instead, she looked at the Alpha King, really looked at him, and saw something she recognized in the desperate set of his shoulders, the way his hands pressed against his ears, the way the world was clearly crushing him from all sides. She knew that feeling. She knew what helped. Meredith opened her mouth and hummed. Soft, rhythmic. The same tuneless melody she'd hummed over washing stones and in the darkness of her quarters when the day's humiliations became too heavy to carry in silence. The effect was instantaneous. Edmund's breathing stuttered, then steadied. His shoulders lowered fractionally. His hands slowly unclenched from the sides of his head. The desperate, drowning look in his eyes began to clear, replaced by something focused and present and aware. The training hall corridor went utterly silent. Guards froze mid-step. Council members stared. Even the distant kitchen noise seemed to pause in disbelief. Then Councillor Verin laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that shattered the moment like glass. An Omega thinks she calmed the Alpha King. Her voice dripped with mockery. Other voices joined in, snickers from servants who'd gathered to watch, sneers from council members. How pathetic. Look at her. Thinks she's special now. Did you see her face? Gods, the arrogance. Remove her, Thorne ordered again, his face twisted with disgust, before she contaminates His Majesty further with her presence. Hands grabbed Meredith's arms, rough, punishing. The wire brush clattered to the floor as she was hauled to her feet. I was only trying to... Shut up, Wolfless. They dragged her backward down the corridor, her feet scrambling for purchase on stone still slick with cleaning solution. Humiliation burned hot in her chest, crawling up her throat, stinging behind her eyes. Stupid. So stupid. What were you thinking? But just before they rounded the corner, Meredith looked back. Edmund Ironvale was standing now, fully upright, his breathing even and his gaze locked directly on her. Not through her, not past her, on her. And in his pale grey eyes, Meredith saw something that made her breath catch despite everything. Recognition. Then she was yanked around the corner, and he was gone. Edmund stood in the empty corridor long after the guards had dispersed, long after the council had retreated in uncomfortable silence, long after the Omega's presence had been scrubbed from the hall like another bloodstain. But he could still hear it. That sound. Her sound. And for the first time in 3 days, 3 years, maybe longer, Edmund Ironvale's mind was quiet. The next 2 days were the worst Edmund had experienced in years. The healers came first, 3 of them, summoned by the council with increasing desperation. They brought tinctures that made his head feel stuffed with wool, poultices that reeked so strongly he couldn't breathe, and endless questions delivered in voices too loud and too close. Your Majesty, if you could just describe the sensation. Does light worsen the episodes? Have you tried focusing on a single point? Edmund endured it for 4 hours before he shattered a ceramic bowl against the wall and ordered them out. The sedatives came next. Councillor Thorne delivered them personally, his expression carefully neutral. A solution from the Eastern Healers Guild, Your Majesty, guaranteed to calm the mind and ease sensory distress. Edmund took them because he was desperate, because the world had become unbearable, because he needed something to stop the constant assault of sensation that left him raw and bleeding from the inside out. The sedatives turned his thoughts to sludge. They dulled the edges of sensation, yes, but they dulled everything else with it. His ability to think strategically, his awareness of threats, and the careful control he'd spent 17 years building. He felt absent from his own body, a passenger watching from behind thick glass as his kingdom continued without him. On the 3rd day, he stopped taking them. The withdrawal was immediate and catastrophic. It started during the council's evening session, the one they'd insisted he attend, the one he'd forced himself through despite every instinct screaming at him to stay in his chambers. Too many bodies in the council chamber. Too many voices overlapping. Torch smoke thick enough to choke on. The scratch of quills on parchment, like knives on slate. Edmund lasted 20 minutes. Then Councillor Verin raised her voice, sharp, insistent, demanding immediate response to some policy he couldn't focus on. And something inside him snapped. The shutdown hit like a physical blow, then his vision tunneled. His hearing fractured into disconnected fragments of sound. His body locked down completely, every muscle seizing at once, leaving him rigid in his chair and utterly unable to move. Distantly, he heard shouting, "Your Majesty! Someone help him! Not again, gods, not again!" Hands on his shoulders. He couldn't feel them properly, just pressure, wrong and invasive and too much. He needed them to stop. He needed silence. He needed... Meredith. The word came out broken, barely audible, but the room went silent anyway. What did he say? Did he just... The Omega? Councillor Thorne's voice cracked with outrage. Absolutely not. Your Majesty, you cannot possibly... Meredith. Edmund forced the word out again, clearer this time, through a throat that felt like it was closing. The council erupted into chaos. Xiao, this is madness. An Omega has no place. He's not thinking clearly. Bring her. Edmund's voice cut through the noise, sharp enough to draw blood. Now. They brought her 20 minutes later. Meredith entered the king's chambers, trembling, flanked by 2 guards whose expressions made it clear they considered this entire situation beneath their dignity. Councillor Thorne established the rules before she'd taken 3 steps inside. No touching the king. No speaking unless spoken to. You will sit where instructed and remain silent. 1 misstep, Omega, and you will be removed permanently. Am I understood? Yes, Councillor. Meredith's voice was barely a whisper. Edmund watched from his position near the hearth, sitting on the floor because the chair felt wrong, his back against the stone wall, his breathing still uneven from the shutdown's aftermath. She looked terrified. Her hands twisted in her stained apron, her eyes fixed on the floor, her entire body angled slightly away, as though preparing to flee. You may sit, Edmund said quietly. Meredith hesitated, then lowered herself to the floor 6 feet away from him, far enough to be respectful, close enough to hear if he spoke. The guards remained by the door. Thorne stood watching with undisguised disapproval. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Meredith noticed the torches. Without asking permission, without drawing attention to herself, she rose and moved to the nearest sconce. She adjusted the flame downward, not extinguishing it, just dimming it. Then the next, and the next. The light in the chamber softened. Edmund's shoulders lowered fractionally. Meredith returned to her spot on the floor, and after a moment's hesitation, began to hum. The sound was quiet, almost fragile in the stone chamber. The same tuneless melody he'd heard in the corridor. But here, in the controlled space, it filled the silence without demanding anything of it. Edmund's breathing began to even out. The fractures in his sensory processing started to knit back together. The world stopped pressing in from all sides. He found himself leaning, just slightly, toward where she sat. Not toward her exactly, toward the presence she created, the stillness, the absence of demand or expectation or judgment. Councillor Thorne shifted by the door, clearly preparing to speak. Out. Edmund's voice was steady now, controlled. All of you, leave us. Your Majesty, propriety demands. Out. The guards left first, it followed by a furious Thorne, whose departing glare at Meredith promised consequences. The door closed. Silence settled over the chamber, comfortable now rather than oppressive. Meredith continued humming softly, her presence as unobtrusive as firelight. Edmund closed his eyes, and for the first time in 4 days, felt his mind quiet completely. The Omega was not calming him. She was grounding him, and that was far more dangerous. The first time Meredith bandaged Edmund's hands, she didn't ask permission. It was the 7th night she'd been summoned to his chambers, though summoned felt too formal for what had become routine. Edmund would send word through a guard. Meredith would come. She would adjust the lighting, hum quietly, and exist in his space without demanding anything of it. Tonight, though, Edmund's knuckles were bleeding. The shutdown had been brief but violent, triggered by an afternoon council session that had run too long, with too many voices, too many demands. He'd made it back to his chambers before collapsing, but not before punching the stone wall hard enough to split skin. Meredith noticed immediately. She rose from her spot by the hearth, crossed to the washing basin, and returned with clean cloth and water, without saying a word. Edmund watched her approach with wary eyes. "May I?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. He hesitated, then extended his hands. Meredith worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the scraped knuckles, applying salve from the healing kit the servants kept stocked, wrapping clean linen around the worst of the damage. Her touch was light, clinical, but something about the care in it made Edmund's chest tighten. You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know." Meredith tied off the bandage and sat back. But leaving wounds untended makes them worse. She wasn't talking about his hands. Edmund knew that. Their eyes met for a brief moment, before Meredith looked away, color rising in her cheeks. "Thank you," Edmund said. It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything. Meredith's hands stilled in her lap. "You're welcome, Your Majesty." 3 nights later, Meredith flinched. It was instinctive. A guard had entered to deliver a message, and his voice boomed across the chamber in the military cadence they all used. Sharp, authoritative. Exactly the tone that had preceded every humiliation Meredith had endured in the keep. She hunched her shoulders and looked down, making herself smaller. Edmund noticed. "Lower your voice," he said, his tone cutting through the guard's report. The guard faltered. "Your Majesty, when you enter my chambers, you will speak at a reasonable volume. Shouting is unnecessary." Edmund's gaze flicked to Meredith, who was still tensed by the hearth. "It disturbs the peace." Yes, Your Majesty. My apologies." The guard continued his report in a softer tone, delivered his message, and left. Silence settled back over the room. Meredith slowly raised her head, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to." "Yes," Edmund interrupted quietly. "I did." Something shifted in Meredith's eyes, surprise giving way to tentative understanding. She returned to her humming, but her shoulders had relaxed. Edmund watched the firelight play across her features and felt something dangerous taking root in his chest. The night Edmund explained the stars, and neither of them had planned it. Meredith had been staring out the narrow window, while Edmund worked through correspondence by the fire. The silence between them had grown comfortable, companionable even. She hummed absently, and he wrote, and the world beyond the chamber ceased to exist. "Do you ever look at them?" Meredith asked suddenly, her voice soft enough that Edmund almost missed it. "The stars?" She nodded. Edmund set down his quill and joined her at the window. The northern sky stretched vast and clear above the keep, constellations sharp against the darkness. "Every night," he admitted, "when I was younger, They were the only thing that made sense. Meredith glanced at him, curiosity overriding her usual caution. How so? Patterns. Edmund pointed to the hunter constellation. Predictable. Ordered. They don't change based on mood or circumstance. They simply are. When the world felt chaotic, when I felt chaotic, the stars reminded me that order existed. Somewhere. Order in chaos, Meredith murmured. Exactly. They stood side by side, close enough that Edmund could feel the warmth radiating from her presence. Not touching. They never touched, save for the night she'd bandaged his hands, but near enough that the space between them felt charged, with something neither was ready to name. I always thought they looked lonely, Meredith said quietly, so far apart from each other. Edmund turned to look at her. The moonlight caught the silver in her hair, painted shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of too many nights spent scrubbing floors instead of sleeping. They're not apart, he said. They're connected. Sue, we just have to know how to see the lines between them. Meredith met his gaze, and for a moment Edmund forgot how to breathe. Edmund, she started, his name bare and intimate without the title. A sharp knock rattled the door. They both stepped back reflexively, too quickly, too guiltily. Your Majesty, Councillor Thorne's voice carried through the wood, the Moon Council requires your presence, immediately. Edmund's jaw clenched. It's past midnight. Nevertheless, Meredith was already moving toward the servants' entrance, her head down, her walls back up. Meredith. Edmund's voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned, hope and fear warring in her expression. Tomorrow, he asked. The smallest smile touched her lips. Tomorrow. She slipped through the door and was gone. Edmund stood alone in the empty chamber and staring at the space where she'd been, his mind quiet, but his heart anything but. The Omega had become essential, and the Council was going to destroy her for it. The whispers started in the servants' corridors first, then spread like rot through the keep. Meredith heard them in fragments, carried on drafts through doorways, hissed between servants during meal preparations, spoken just loud enough to ensure she couldn't miss them. 3 weeks now, she's been going to his chambers. Every night, sometimes until dawn. What could a wolfless Omega possibly offer an Alpha King? The implication hung heavy in the air, ugly and deliberate. Meredith kept her head down and scrubbed harder at whatever task had been assigned to her. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only made the mockery worse. But the whispers didn't stay in the servants' quarters. Meredith was carrying linens past the council chamber when she heard Councillor Verin's voice, sharp and certain, through the partially open door. The Omega is manipulating him. It's the only explanation. She has no wolf, Thorne added, no rank, no power of her own. Yet somehow she's gained unprecedented access to the king's private chambers. Access even we are denied. It's dangerous. Another voice, Councillor Brennan. An Omega controlling a king is a threat to the entire kingdom's stability. What happens when she decides to whisper commands in his ear? When she turns his judgment to serve her own interests? Laughter rippled through the chamber. Cold. Calculated. The same laughter that had followed her through every humiliation she'd ever endured. That creature couldn't manipulate her way out of dishwater, Verin said dismissively. But the king's attachment to her is concerning nonetheless. It makes him look weak, unstable. The Pax are already questioning his fitness. Then we remove her, Thorne said flatly, for his own good. Meredith's hands tightened on the linens until her knuckles went white. She forced herself to keep walking, to keep breathing, to make it to the laundry room before the tears came. "They're right," she thought, as she collapsed against the washing stones. "You're making everything worse. You're making him look weak. You should never have—" She bit down on her knuckle to muffle the sob. That night, when the guard came to summon her to Edmund's chambers, Meredith sent him back with a message. "Tell His Majesty I'm unwell." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her chest felt hollowed out, her throat tight with shame that wouldn't ease no matter how many times she told herself the council's words didn't matter. But they did. They always had. Edmund noticed her absence within minutes. He waited an hour, assuming she'd been delayed. Then another hour, his mind growing increasingly restless as the familiar sensory pressure began building again. When the guard returned with her message, Edmund's stomach dropped. "Unwell how?" "She didn't say, Your Majesty." Edmund dismissed the guard and sat alone in his chambers, staring at the fire Meredith always adjusted just so, listening to the silence that felt suffocating without her presence to soften it. She'd never missed a night, not once in 3 weeks. Something was wrong. The next night, Meredith came when summoned, but everything about her was different. She kept her distance, sitting near the door instead of by the hearth. She didn't adjust the lighting. Her humming, when it came, sounded mechanical, hollow. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Edmund lasted 20 minutes before speaking. "What happened?" "Nothing, Your Majesty." "Don't lie to me." His voice came out sharper than intended, and he watched her flinch. He softened his tone. "Meredith, what happened?" Her hands twisted in her apron. "The council is right. I shouldn't be here." "The council?" Edmund's jaw clenched. "What did they say?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "It shouldn't." Meredith's voice cracked, and she finally looked up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm making everything worse for you. They think I'm manipulating you. They think you look weak because of me. They're probably planning to remove me. And they should, because I'm just a burden you don't need." Edmund crossed the room in 4 strides and knelt in front of her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she had to see him. "You are not a burden." "But I am." The tears spilled over now, tracking down her cheeks. "I'm wolfless. I'm nobody. I have nothing to offer you except whatever this is, and it's not enough. It's never enough. They laugh at me, Edmund. They always have. And now they're laughing at you too because of me. I don't care what they think. You should." Meredith's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're a king. You need someone strong beside you. Someone with power and status and... I need you." The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Meredith shook her head, standing abruptly. I should go." "Meredith, please." Her voice broke completely. "Just let me go." Edmund watched helplessly as she fled through the servants' entrance, leaving him alone in chambers that suddenly felt vast and empty. He didn't follow. He should have. But the damage was already done. Not by anything he'd said, but by years of cruelty that had convinced her she wasn't worthy of the one thing she'd finally found. A place where she belonged. The announcement came at dawn, delivered by Councillor Thorne with a finality that left no room for argument. "The Moon Council has arranged your binding ceremony, Your Majesty. Lady Celestine of the Eastern Pax. The ceremony will take place in 3 days' time in the Great Hall, as tradition demands." Edmund looked up from the reports he'd been trying to focus on, his mind still fractured from another sleepless night, without Meredith's grounding presence. I did not authorize this. The council acted in the kingdom's best interest. Thorn's expression was carved from stone. You need an heir, Your Majesty. A proper mate of alpha blood. Lady Celestine is well-bred, politically advantageous, and... I said no. Your Majesty. Thorn's voice hardened. This is not a request. The invitations have been sent. The Eastern Pacts have accepted. To refuse now would be an insult that could fracture alliances we cannot afford to lose. Edmund's hands curled into fists atop his desk. You orchestrated this deliberately. We did what you refused to do. Thorn leaned forward, his voice dropping. The kingdom needs stability. It needs heirs. It needs a king who appears strong and capable, not one who hides in his chambers with a wolfless servant girl. The words hit like a physical blow. Get out. 3 days, Your Majesty. The ceremony is at sunset. I suggest you prepare yourself. Thorn left before Edmund could respond. Edmund sat alone in the suffocating silence, knowing with absolute certainty that the council had designed this trap perfectly. Public, loud, ceremonial, everything he couldn't endure. And with Meredith gone, withdrawn behind walls of shame and self-doubt he didn't know how to breach, he would face it alone. Meredith heard about the binding ceremony from the kitchen servants, their voices bright with gossip as they prepared for the upcoming feast. Lady Celestine arrived this morning. Did you see her? Absolutely stunning. 3 days to prepare a royal binding. The council must be desperate. Well, the king needs a proper mate, someone worthy of the throne. Someone worthy. Meredith's hands trembled as she scrubbed the pot in front of her, the words cutting deeper than they should have. She'd known this would happen eventually. Had known from the beginning that whatever existed between her and Edmund was temporary. A brief respite before reality reasserted itself. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. That night, head servant Margrave delivered her orders personally. You are forbidden from the great hall during the ceremony. Forbidden from the king's chambers. Forbidden from any area Lady Celestine might encounter you. His lip curled. The counsel was quite clear. You are not to be seen. Meredith nodded, not trusting her voice. She was being erased, as though she'd never mattered at all. The binding ceremony began at sunset on the 3rd day. The great hall blazed with torchlight, hundreds of flames reflecting off polished armor and ceremonial weapons mounted on every wall. The northern, eastern, and western packs filled the space, their combined voices creating a wall of sound that crashed against stone and echoed endlessly. Edmund stood at the center of it all, every sense screaming. Too bright, too loud, too many scents, perfumes and oils and sweat and smoke, all mixing into something that made his stomach turn. Lady Celestine stood beside him in ceremonial robes, beautiful and poised and utterly wrong. The high priestess began the traditional words, her voice rising and falling in rhythmic cadence that should have been soothing, but instead felt like blades scraping against Edmund's mind. His vision began to tunnel. The voices multiplied, conversations overlapping, laughter echoing, the priestess's words blending into meaningless noise. His hands started to shake. Breathe, control it. You've done this before. But he hadn't. Not like this. Not without... Edmund. Lady Celestine's voice, close to his ear. Are you well? Too close. Her perfume was suffocating. Her hand touched his arm, and every muscle in his body locked down in rejection. The shutdown hit like an avalanche. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the ceremonial altar, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his entire body seizing as the sensory overload became catastrophic. Silence crashed over the hall. "Your Majesty!" Hands reached for him. Too many hands, grabbing, pulling, making everything infinitely worse. Edmund collapsed to the stone floor, hands clamped over his ears, chest heaving, and the world fracturing into incomprehensible fragments of light and sound and sensation. "Someone help him! Get the healers!" "What's happening?" Through the chaos, Edmund heard Councillor Thorne's cold voice, perfectly clear. "Let him work through it. No healers, no interventions." "But your Majesty is clearly—" "No Omega this time," Thorne cut in sharply. "He must learn that his dependency is a weakness. He will overcome this himself, or he will prove the Council's concerns justified." Edmund tried to speak, to demand Meredith, to do anything except lie broken on the floor, while hundreds of pack members watched their king shatter in front of them. But his voice wouldn't work. His body wouldn't work. The world was ending, and he was drowning, and the only person who could pull him back was forbidden from saving him. Meredith heard the commotion from 3 floors below, shouts echoing through stone corridors, the sudden chaos of hundreds of voices rising at once. Something was wrong. She was supposed to stay away, had been ordered to remain in the servants' quarters, invisible and forgotten, while Edmund bound himself to someone worthy. But her feet were already moving. She ran, through the kitchen, past startled servants who shouted after her, up the spiral staircase, her lungs burning, through corridors she wasn't permitted to enter. Guards blocked the entrance to the great hall. No servants beyond this point. Meredith didn't slow down. She ducked under the first guard's arm, shoved past the second, and burst through the doors into a scene of utter chaos. The great hall was packed with nobility from 3 packs, all pressed back against the walls, and staring at the center of the room where Edmund Ironvale lay, collapsed on the stone floor. His body was locked rigid, hands clamped over his ears, chest heaving in desperate, strangled gasps. His eyes were open but unseeing, lost somewhere in the sensory hell only he could perceive. Lady Celestine stood frozen several paces away, her face pale with shock. The council formed a loose circle around their king, watching, waiting, refusing to intervene. "Let him overcome it himself," Councillor Thorne was saying coldly. "This dependency ends tonight." Meredith's vision went red. She broke through the circle of nobility, her servant's dress a blur of motion against ceremonial finery. "Stop her!" "The Omega!" Guards moved to intercept, but Meredith was faster, driven by something far stronger than fear or self-preservation. She dropped to her knees in front of Edmund, ignoring the gasps that rippled through the hall, ignoring Thorne's furious shout, ignoring everything except the man drowning in front of her. "Edmund!" Her voice cracked. "I'm here." She didn't touch him, knew better than to add sensation to his overload. Instead, she did the only thing that had ever worked. She hummed. Through tears that blurred her vision, through the trembling in her chest, through the weight of 300 pairs of eyes judging her, Meredith hummed the tuneless melody that had become their lifeline. Soft, steady, unwavering. The effect wasn't immediate this time. Edmund was too far gone, lost too deep in the sensory collapse. But Meredith kept humming, kept existing in his space without demanding, kept offering the ground he needed beneath his feet. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Edmund's breathing began to even out. His hands unclenched from the sides of his head. His eyes focused, finding her through the chaos. His hand shot out and gripped hers, the first time he'd ever initiated touch. The contact sent a shock through them both, something elemental and undeniable that made the air itself seem to crystallize. Meredith's humming caught, then steadied. Edmund's fingers tightened around hers as he used her presence to pull himself back from the edge, to reconstruct the world piece by fragile piece, until he could breathe again, think again, be again. He stood, slowly, shakily, but with Meredith's hand anchoring him to reality. The great hall had gone utterly silent. Edmund turned to face the council, his pale eyes blazing with fury that was perfectly controlled, perfectly clear, and absolutely devastating. "She is my calm," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Not my weakness, not my dependency, my calm." "Your Majesty, this is highly inappropriate," Thorn started. "You orchestrated this." Edmund's words cut like a blade. "Forced a binding I never consented to. Forbade the one person who could help me. Let me collapse in front of the Pax to prove your point about my fitness to rule." He took a step forward, Meredith's hand still clasped in his. "You failed." "The Omega is manipulating." "The Omega," Edmund interrupted, his voice dropping to something dangerous, "is mine." The word echoed through the hall, and then something shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with power that had nothing to do with alpha dominance and everything to do with something older, deeper, written in moonlight and instinct. The mate bond snapped into place. Meredith gasped as it hit, a golden thread of connection that wound through her chest and bound itself to Edmund's heart, unbreakable and undeniable and chosen, not by the council, not by tradition, chosen by them. Through the windows, moonlight suddenly flooded the hall, silver and radiant and impossibly bright for the sliver of crescent that hung in the sky. The moon was answering. Witnesses throughout the hall fell silent, feeling the weight of something sacred taking root. Lady Celestine stepped back, her hand pressed to her chest, eyes wide with understanding. "The bond," she whispered. "It's already formed." Councillor Thorne's face went white. "This is impossible. The ceremony wasn't complete." "The ceremony," Edmund said softly, his eyes never leaving Meredith's, "was never necessary. The moon chose her long before you tried to choose for me." Meredith's tears spilled over, but this time they weren't from shame. Edmund raised her hand to his lips, a gesture so tender, so public, so deliberately defiant, that gasps rippled through the assembled Pax. "You are not a burden," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are the only thing keeping me whole." The council had no response. The moon had spoken. And for the first time in her life, Meredith stood in a hall full of people who could no longer pretend she didn't exist. The Moon Council fell within a week, not through violence or exile, but through something far more devastating: irrelevance. Edmund invoked an ancient law, one buried so deep in Pact tradition that the Council had forgotten it existed. The law stated clearly that a mate bond recognized by the moon superseded all political arrangements, all council decisions, all attempts at forced binding. The bond between Edmund and Meredith had been witnessed by 3 Pax, blessed by moonlight, and sealed in a way no ceremony could replicate. The Council's carefully orchestrated trap had become their own undoing. Thorne resigned in disgrace. Verin followed. Brennan held on for 3 days before the pressure from the Eastern Pax, who considered the forced binding attempt an insult to Lady Celestine, made his position untenable. The remaining council members bent or broke. Edmund restructured everything. The new laws were written over 6 weeks, drafted in Edmund's chambers with Meredith sitting beside him, no longer on the floor, but in a chair pulled close to his, in offering perspective the old council had never bothered to seek. The consent accords came first. No Omega could be bound, mated, or assigned without explicit consent. Refusal carried no punishment. Choice became sacred, not suggested. The protection of difference followed. Pack members whose minds worked differently, who struggled with crowds or noise or touch, or the countless other ways the world could overwhelm, would be accommodated, not condemned. Sensitivity was reframed as awareness, not weakness. The right to voice completed the trilogy. Omegas gained representation in pack decisions. Their counsel would be heard, their needs considered, their existence valued beyond utility. The laws passed with surprising ease once Edmund made it clear he would accept nothing less. The packs who had watched their king collapse and rise again understood. Strength came in many forms, and some of the strongest bonds were forged in gentleness. Meredith was named royal consort in a private ceremony. Small, quiet, everything the binding attempt had not been. Edmund spoke the words himself, his voice steady. "You are my partner in all things, my calm, my ground, my chosen. What you are to me, the kingdom will recognize." No council interference, no political maneuvering, just truth spoken plainly. Meredith wore a simple dress of silver blue that caught the firelight. No crown, she'd refused one. But the way Edmund looked at her made her feel more regal than any ceremony could have. "I'm still just me," she whispered as he clasped the consort's pendant around her neck. A silver moon on a delicate chain. "You were never just anything," Edmund replied. The changes rippled outward slowly, then all at once. Edmund began appearing at council sessions again, but on his terms. Shorter meetings, smaller groups, breaks when he needed them. The packs adapted because the results spoke for themselves. Their king was sharper, more focused, more strategically brilliant when he wasn't fighting his own senses to function. He stopped hiding what he was, and the kingdom learned to accommodate rather than demand. Meredith walked the keep's corridors openly now, no longer invisible. Servants who had once mocked her now nodded in respect, some genuine, some self-serving, but the cruelty had been stripped away by royal decree and social consequence. She still hummed while working, but now she did it in the royal consort's study, organizing correspondence and managing the Omega welfare programs she'd helped design. She'd found her place, not because someone granted it to her, but because she'd claimed it. 6 months after the binding ceremony that never was, Edmund and Meredith sat together in their private chambers. The fire burned low, adjusted to perfection as always. The torches were dimmed. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the soft scratch of Edmund's quill and Meredith's quiet humming as she mended a torn banner. Edmund set down his quill and simply watched her, the way the firelight caught the silver in her hair, the gentle focus in her expression, the peace she carried that had somehow become his peace too. "What?" Meredith asked, glancing up with a small smile. "Nothing," Edmund said. "Just thank you." "For what?" "For running toward me when everyone else said to stay away." Meredith set down her needle and crossed to him, settling into the chair beside his. She took his hand. The simple touch still sent warmth through them both, the bond humming contentedly. "You would have done the same for me," she said. "I would have," Edmund agreed. "I will." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and the night deepened beyond the windows. Somewhere in the keep, a young Omega was reading the new laws for the first time, discovering that consent mattered, that difference was protected, that gentleness had value. Somewhere, a parent was explaining to their overwhelmed child that the world could be adjusted, that accommodation wasn't weakness, that the Alpha King himself proved it was possible to lead and struggle and still be whole. And in the royal consort's chambers, two people who had been taught they were broken sat together in perfect understanding. Edmund leaned back in his chair, Meredith's hand warm in his, her presence steadying him the way it always did. He thought of the years he'd spent fighting his own mind, hiding his struggles, believing the world's cruelty when it called him unstable. He thought of Meredith, scrubbing floors and absorbing mockery, convinced she'd never matter to anyone. They'd both been wrong. He wasn't broken. The world had simply been too loud. And she, gentle, intuitive, unshakable Meredith, had taught him that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was exist quietly beside someone until they remembered how to breathe. And Edmund, Meredith's voice pulled him back. Stop thinking so loudly. I can hear you from here. He laughed, a real laugh, rare and genuine. She smiled and resumed her humming. And the Alpha King, no longer alone in the silence, finally let himself rest. The end. If this moonlit story stirred something in you, let me know in the comments what kind of love story you'd like to see. Because every heart deserves a tale where gentleness wins, difference is honored, and chosen love conquers all.